Okay, so what I'm going to be doing today is trying to tell you about media portrayals. And just to start with, some housekeeping to begin with, and hopefully it's working. So what we'd like is for you to make any comments that you have on the Facebook feed, and likes and any questions on there as well. I've got a team of helpers who are taking questions in, and at the end of the talk, I will answer all of the questions. So I won't answer the questions when they come in, I'll answer them at the end. So please do bear with me. If you're a tweeting type person, please do tweet about the talk. My Twitter handle is @AshokJansari, and my hashtag is #TheBrainGuy. We've got a participant database for anyone who's interested in the work that we're doing, and I'll tell you more about this later on in the talk. Finally, before the talk itself starts, I need to let you know that I've got a set of talks that I gave in the first lockdown, and there are 10 of those talks. There are recordings of those talks, and I will make the link for that available so that you can see what else I've done before. Okay, I want to welcome everyone from around the world. These are some of the languages that were represented by people who had attended my talks before. So I'm hoping that some of you are here this time, and if you are, welcome. And this is a map of the different countries in the world that we had people tuning in from, and I hope that you're here again today. I'd like to say a special hello to those people in India and my Indian friends around the world, because today is Diwali, which is the Festival of Lights, and it's a very important festival for Hindus, and it's like the Christmas. So happy Diwali to all my Indian friends around the world. Okay, I'm just going to get my thanks out of the way to begin with. My thanks to these two people, especially Loci, who's been holding my hand, helping me sort this stuff out. And also Jason Reed. Thank you so much, Jason, for trying to help me and sorting out that privacy setting. But also especially to these wonderful women, Claudia, Priyanka, Anisha, Kim, Andrea, and Ida, who've all been really wonderful in helping me source information for this talk. Okay, so here's an outline for the talk. First of all, I'm going to talk about why does it matter what the media portrays? What is the point of all of this? Then I'm going to tell you about head injuries, and that's really important because of the fact that we have different things going on with the types of head injuries that people can experience, and what happens as a result of head injuries. Then I'm going to go into the area that I'm most familiar with, which is human memory, and the issues that are portrayed in the media and what can happen as a result of those. And then into an area that is an area that I'm moving into, dementia, which is a real global issue. So those are the three areas that I'm going into, and I'm just going to check a message from my team of helpers to make sure that you can all hear me. Okay, so here we go. Why does it matter what the media portrays? This photograph looks somewhat familiar. Someone with gloves on and a visor, etc., to possibly protect them from some things. Well, that's from the film Contagion, which was a film about an outbreak of a very contagious virus, etc. And the reason that this is important is because of the media portrayal of it. So this is a quote from Richard Bezer, who was the former acting director of the Center for Disease Control, which is in the States and was really important for Ebola, etc. And what Dr. Bezer said was that in many ways, it gets the science right, so the film Contagion. But I was struck by the speed by which they created a new vaccine and saved the world. That's misleading. Creating vaccines that are safe and effective can take a long time and can be elusive. The rapid creation of a vaccine in Contagion can contribute to the false expectation of what science can do during a public health crisis. Now, this is extremely pertinent to our day today because of what's happening with COVID and the undue pressure that's being put on companies that are trying to create the vaccine and this idea that it should just be ready. And part of this is because of media portrayals of what science can do and how science can do it yesterday. Science is an amazing thing, but it takes time, especially when you've got these diseases that are rapidly multiplying and evolving. So just this idea from Contagion about creating vaccines and being able to get them out to people really quickly in a couple of days or a couple of weeks, we can see that that's just not the case. And many of us are unable to travel, etc., particularly because of this. And indeed, my lockdown talks are because people are sitting at home, and I thought I'd entertain them a bit. Here's another quote, and this is more from neuropsychologists, and they say that the media offer powerful tools to communicate information about health issues, having the capacity to create awareness and positively influence perceptions, beliefs, and attitudes. So they're very good. Film and media producers do not merely set out to provide an accurate description of dementia. They have an interest in obtaining a certain impact, in providing entertainment, suspense, and dramatic effect. So the point of this quote is that media can be very powerful. However, there is a responsibility there. And in the case of dementia, for example, sometimes that can go wrong and it can result in problems, partly because the point of the movies is to create this sense of entertainment. This is another quote I found, which is that although license is integral to the art of filmmaking, the majority of non-documentary filmic portrayals of neurological disease are simply dishonest. Maybe they should carry a health warning. And this, I think, is actually from two neurologists writing about what people think about from portrayals of neurological disease. So this is effectively the background to why I wanted to give this talk. And finally, this is a quote from Sally Baxendale, who I would like to thank because she gave me some material for this talk. And she talks particularly about amnesia and epilepsy. She says, since movies both inform and reflect public opinion, doctors should be aware of the prevalent myths about amnesia. This could be invaluable when informing patients and their relatives of a diagnosis of an amnesic condition and its likely prognosis. This is quite important because Sally talks about doctors being aware here. Now, most people don't realize that a medical doctor, or a general practitioner, for example, doesn't really know much about amnesia because they're not trained to know about amnesia and dementia. They are general practitioners who know lots of things, but they don't have the depth of understanding of neurological disorders, which is why they would refer someone to a neurologist for further assessment. So it's really important that even healthcare professionals realize that there are lots of myths that they need to get around themselves. And I've even seen this in psychologists and even sometimes neuropsychologists who don't understand some of the subtleties of some of the conditions that we're working with. Okay, now just before I go into head injuries, I'm just going to check whether there's a problem that's coming in. No, it sounds like it's okay. Okay, so questions are coming in, which is great. So I want to start with head injuries. So we all get head injuries, we fall, we knock our head against something, some people play sports. So what happens with head injury? So I'm going to turn to something that takes me back to my childhood. I hope you can hear the sound because we'd set it up so that you could. Tom and Jerry is a beloved cartoon from my childhood. And here is a clip from Tom and Jerry, and we'll see what happens. I left this in because of this lovely music. Sorry about that. There was a sound issue there. But hopefully, as with most cartoons, it was very visual. The reason for showing you this is because this is a classic thing that used to be shown certainly in cartoons and even slapstick comedy, that someone gets hit on the head and following a hit on the head, they just change personality and they become someone else. And we see here that the cat Tom starts acting like a mouse as a result of a head injury. And then the mouse looks in a medical encyclopedia, and what he sees is that a hit to the head can result in amnesia. And what he needs to do is to reverse this by hitting the cat on the head again. Well, this is fake news, completely rubbish. And actually, it's quite dangerous in a way to try to propagate this sort of myth. A film by with Will Smith in it called Concussion is on a similar note. It's about head injuries. So what's the case here? Well, in fact, this is true, and it's based on a true story of a Nigerian doctor who noticed a real pattern with a number of autopsies that he was performing with men who were in their early 40s, let's say, who had died very young and who'd all had quite aggressive behavioral problems just before death. And importantly, they'd all been American football players. And what he saw was that when he autopsied their brains looked like the brains of 80-year-old people with dementia. And he started the first work that suggested that having lots of knocks on your head is not good for you. And here is the reason for this. Now, the brain is some soft tissue. It's like a jelly, and it's in a very hard container, which is the skull. if you were to hit your head against a wall, what happens is that you've got this very hard outer casing, it's the skull, and then you've got a jelly within it, which is still moving when your head hits against the wall. So the skull hits the wall, but the jelly inside it is still moving, and the jelly hits against the front of the skull. And as a result of that, what happens is that although the skull doesn't break, you get bruising to the front of the head. And this is why whiplash and things like that in car crashes are actually, it can be quite problematic, because although the skull hasn't broken, you could be precipitating head injury, some sort of brain injury. So this can happen if you're doing it once, if it happens occasionally. But there are people for whom this is part of their job. So, for example, NFL players in the States. And what was found, which is what partly the film was about, concussion, is that about a third of NFL players were retiring with conditions that resembled Alzheimer's or dementia. Because basically they're having these jellies within their skulls being hit constantly, being pushed, being deceleration, acceleration, hitting, etc. And as a result of this, there was actually a lawsuit, and the Players Union sued the NFL because of this. Indeed, in the UK, the rules of rugby at school have changed, specifically because of this, because we've realized that it's not good for young brains to be hit around. And in fact, that is going to be partly the basis of my next talk, because what we have are young brains that aren't fully formed, and they're getting hit about in games like rugby. And so they've had to change the rules of that because of this growing understanding that hitting a brain is not good, and hitting a developing child's brain is even worse. In Scotland, for example, in school football, now it's a foul if a child headers a ball, because it's been noticed that even heading the ball just briefly still has a small amount of impact. And the point here is that it's lots and lots and lots of small impacts that are going to add up to this big form of brain damage. Now moving into memory and amnesia, which is always been my first love in neuropsychology. Here is a famous film, The 51st Dates with Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler.
Nice to meet you. Whoa, amber is the color of your energy. The only problem is, whoa, shades of naturally. What is going on?
About a year ago, Lucy was in a terrible car accident. She lost her short-term memory.
She won't remember him tomorrow.
You and I are actually seeing each other.
Don't worry, you're not going to suffer any short-term memory loss, but...
Okay, so here we have this young lady who meets this guy, they fall in love, and the following morning she freaks out because she doesn't know who he is and hits him on the head, which you already know from the previous one, from what I said previously is not good. Well, this is a load of rubbish. Amnesia does not work like that at all. Amnesia is much more complex than that. You can't go 12 hours with someone having these lovely romantic times and then just at night forget them. So we're going to turn to another film, and let's see what's happening in this one. This is another favorite of people's. Let's see where this is.
Which way?
Oh, it went, this way. It went this way. Follow me.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Wait!
here? What, the ocean isn't big enough for you or something like that? Huh? You got a problem, buddy? Huh? Huh? Do you? Want a piece of me? Yeah. Ooh, I'm scared now. What?
Wait a minute.
Stop following me, okay?
What are you talking about? You're showing me which way the boat went.
A boat? Hey, I've seen a boat. It passed by not too long ago. It went, this way. It went this way. Follow me.
Wait a minute. What is going on? You already told me which way the boat was going.
I did? Oh, no.
If this is some kind of practical joke, it's not funny. And I know funny. I'm a clownfish.
No, it's not. I know it's not. I'm so sorry. See, I suffer from short-term memory loss.
Short-term memory loss. I don't believe this.
No, it's true. I forget things almost instantly. It runs in my family.
Okay, so here we have Dory, who is the blue fish, and she says she suffers from amnesia, and she says a short-term memory loss, and she says she forgets things almost instantly. So what's happening here? Well, this is much more accurate, and it's rather lovely that a children's cartoon managed to get this more correct. So what we have here is that while she's talking to the clownfish, she's okay. But within a couple of a minute or so, she's forgotten who he is. No,
I guess I've already told you about my fish.
Is this one
You don't remember where you've been or what you've just done.
I can't make new memories. Everything just fades.
So that was just a very short clip, but it's from a film called Memento, which involves this guy who claims to have a memory problem and it says that everything fades very quickly. And in fact, this is one of the best portrayals of memory problems that we see in the movies. In fact, the character, they used some of what we know from one of the most famous patients who's ever been studied, called HM, who had the middle parts of his temporal lobes, which are over here, removed to control epilepsy. And as a result of that, they cured his or reduced his epilepsy, but he was not able to lay down another long-term memory for more than 50 years until he passed away. And what we see in the film here is that the character doesn't have the ability to store memories, just like with Dory. But in the case of this character in Memento, what he does is that he starts creating his memories by externalizing them in terms of by way of tattoos. So he starts tattooing himself, if you've seen this film. So what we see here is something rather interesting. That memory is a store, and it's something we store in here. And as we saw with Dory, there isn't that ability to hold the information together or store it somewhere. And we see this in the character in Memento as well. But what he does is that he externalizes his memory in the form of these tattoos. And that's rather important, because we know that this is the case with our own memory. We know that memory is a case of fading footprints. We know from work that's been done for over 100 years that as our retention interval, which is basically how long since something happened, as that increases, the strength of our memory gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and that's perfectly okay. So the trauma of what happened with not being able to get the talk live is still really fresh for me, whereas this morning is less fresh for me, and last week is even less fresh for me. So something that happened recently is very much there. There's a strong trace, but something that happened a week ago, the trace has gone down. So those are fading footprints, and what the character in Memento says is that his memories fade extremely quickly. So that is an accurate portrayal. The thing is that we know that in these patients, like Dory and this character, but also the famous patient HM that I was referring to earlier, what's happening is that their memory fades very, very quickly. About 90 seconds is about as much as they have. Now, by studying people like HM, and many other famous patients, we work out that memory is actually at least two different things. It's a short-term store, which is about 90 seconds long. So if I tell you my office number, it would be held in short-term memory. So the conversation that Dory was having with the clownfish, Nemo's father, that was in her short-term memory. But as she was swimming away and he was behind her, that information fades away very quickly, and she doesn't have any ability to create a long-term memory, which is the problem. The short-term memory fades away, and part of the problem in amnesia is an inability to create new long-term memories. Then we know that long-term memory itself breaks up into two forms of memory called procedural memory, which is skill-based, such as being able to play a guitar, and fact-based, which is called declarative memory. And the fact-based itself breaks up into two different types of memory, which are episodic, which is events. So this is my 50th birthday cake. So an event, which is my birthday, and remembering that event is an episodic memory. And then purely factual information that's got nothing to do with me, such as Einstein's famous equation. Now, we get this type of understanding by studying people like Dory, not Dory, but the fish, but patients like HM, etc. And importantly, from people like these patients, we work out that things like short-term memory and procedural memory are actually okay in these patients. And this is the kind of information that neuropsychologists are trying to push into the outside world, so that we can use the fact that their short-term memory, which is a minute and a half, not the last few weeks. Most people think short-term memory is the last few weeks. That's not the case. Short-term memory is literally about a minute and a half. And we know that short-term memory and procedural memory are intact in these patients, and we can use those for rehabilitation. So looking at rehabilitation, and this is kind of what the Guy Pearce character was doing in Memento. He was trying to externalize his memories. This is a picture of me with my academic mummy, Professor Barbara Wilson, who's one of the most important people in memory rehabilitation in the world. And she's done marvelous work with lots of patients to use those facts that we know that short-term memory and procedural memory are intact in patients, to try to help them. But here's a quote from her, which is that among neurologists and even many neuropsychologists working with patients with memory problems, the prevailing attitude seems to suggest that little or nothing can be done to alleviate the problems of brain-injured patients. Now, this is rather telling. Earlier, you saw me saying that society doesn't understand science that well, and so we can get these inaccurate media portrayals. And then you saw with the quote from Sally Baxendale that even doctors don't quite understand some of the issues with memory, amnesia, etc., and they need to be more careful. But here, Barbara is saying that even neurologists and many neuropsychologists who work in memory don't understand these issues. And part of that is because it is such a new field. Our understanding that these patients actually have some intact abilities that can be harnessed to help them are actually really new. It's only the last 2 decades or so. And if you're interested in this, then, and you didn't see it, you can see one of my earlier talks, Why Do We Know Less About the Human Brain Than the Dark Side of the Moon, to help you understand why this field is so new. As an example of some of Barbara's work, she met some Californian engineers who developed a small paging device because one of these two men, his son had had a car crash and was forgetting things easily. And being an engineer, the father decided to develop something to help his son remember to do things. And so he created this thing called NeuroPage, which allowed him to send little messages to his son on this paging device that was worn on his belt, and the pager would bleep and his son would then look at it and it would say something like, remember to take your medication or something like that. And the engineers heard Barbara speaking at a conference in California because she was talking about patients with memory problems, and they developed this wonderful service called NeuroPage that fantastic unit in Ely near Cambridge called the Oliver Zangwill Center started developing and have now created a clinical service for. And in this wonderful study by Barbara Wilson and her colleagues, what they did is that they used NeuroPage by harnessing that short-term memory and the procedural memory that's intact in patients with certain memory problems. And they tested patients, say like the character in Memento, at baseline. And baseline is before you've had any treatment. So how successful is someone at doing things or remembering things that they need to without any help? So that's before treatment. And what they found was that the patients remembered about 37% of the time. So about 2/3 of the time they'd forget to do the things that they needed to. Then Barbara and her team would work with these patients and they'd teach them using very laborious techniques how to use this NeuroPage system to respond to the messages, etc. And what they found was that at treatment, so that's the point during the time when they're actually training them to use the NeuroPage, this leapt up to about 87%. Now, importantly, you don't want to keep treating someone. The point of rehabilitation is to leave the person and allow them to have a good quality of life without constant need of more input by therapists just because it costs so much. Post-treatment is the important point. Post-treatment is the time at which you've done the treatment and you've moved away and the person can survive on their own and can improve. And what we see at post-treatment there was that the percentage was 74%, which was exactly twice what it was at baseline. So Barbara and her team did this wonderful work where they showed that by using this small, simple device, a paging device, they could improve the lives of people by harnessing those skills that we know are still intact. And I'm going to show you a small little video of one of the patients that Barbara referred to me, called Nicola, who's there on the left-hand side. And in this video, my student Gail is going to show Nicola a palm top. And a palm top is a precursor to smartphones, and it was possible to set alarms on it to ask someone to do something. So what I want you to do is to listen to what Nicola says about whether she's ever seen this device before or not.
So have you used this machine before?
I can't remember.
Don't recognise it?
I switch it on.
If we just wait a second before we...
I switched it on, yes.
Yeah. So you don't recognise the machine at all?
Okay, so what we see there is that Nicola says that she's never seen this thing before. She certainly doesn't know how to use it. And so we said, okay. Now, in this next video, Gail had set the palm top with a reminder. And we see Nicola is playing a word puzzle on her book there. What I want you to do is to look at Nicola's face and look at her hand and see what happens when the palm top goes off.
Make a cup of tea. Do you want me to make a cup of tea?
I would love a cup of tea if you don't mind. Do you fancy one?
Oh, I'd love a cup of tea, so what do I do now? Dismiss it?
And what you see there is that Nicola, the palm top started buzzing, and Nicola didn't even look at it, but her arm reflexively moved out to pick it up and flick it open. And you saw in the video before that she claimed that she'd never seen this before and didn't know how to use it. So this is data from the study that we did with Nicola. In red is baseline, so before Nicola had been trained how to use the palm top, and these are the daily activities that she would have had to do, such as asking for her medication or things around the house. And you see that she doesn't remember to do anything. Then in dark blue is after we trained her, the improvement. 8 months later, post-training, so we haven't been there for 8 months, and this was when Gail went in and we set these alarms. Nicola was able to do these things without any guidance at all, despite claiming that she'd never seen it before. So kind of like Dory saying, no, I don't know who you are, but still being able to do it. And this is how we can harness the abilities of patients to help them improve their lives. But importantly, going back to the contagion example, it's a very long, laborious process. So these aren't things that happen overnight. This takes a very, very, very long time. And that, I think, is the important point to make here, that we're making small inroads, but if it's presented in the media, then it needs to be done accurately. Sorry, that was a little bit wrong there. Finally, I want to turn to dementia. Dementia is something that is becoming more and more prevalent, as you'll see, and a well-known film that won Julianne Moore an Oscar for Still Alice shows her depicting a character who's a professor of English at Columbia University in New York, and she starts noticing little problems in her memory, and eventually she goes to see a doctor and she's diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and you see her fight with Alzheimer's. So what's the verdict here? The verdict is ish. And by that I mean that it's not fake news. It's her portrayal of the person with Alzheimer's was very good in terms of the fact that it's quite patchy, her memory, sometimes it's okay, sometimes it goes, and then there's a slow deterioration. And so in that sense, it's quite accurate. However, there were problems with this, and I don't know if Rosalind McCarthy, who trained me in Cambridge, she told me that she ended up having a bit of a disagreement with the author of the book, because one of the things in the film is that when Alice goes to see a neurologist, they do a couple of tests, or maybe just one test, and they diagnose her as having dementia from that. And that's the bit that's fake news. Because if we already had that test, then people would be getting tested and diagnosed very quickly and very effectively. However, we are not there at all. Dementia, and Alzheimer's is just one of the dementias, is a very complex condition. And there isn't a silver bullet, and there isn't a gold standard test yet. And this is the reason why, unfortunately, many people go through the anguish of seeing their family members start to have problems, but by the time that they've got a diagnosis, it's almost too late because so much of them has faded away. But as an example of a good depiction, I'm going to go to another medium. This is my friend Tony Husband, who some of you may know of the satirical magazine Private Eye. Tony is an illustrator for Private Eye. And the reason that I'm talking about him is that unfortunately Tony's father developed dementia, and he saw his father disappearing in front of his eyes. And eventually he drew a series of cartoons which are based on his father's fight with dementia. And it's a really wonderful, compelling, true to life depiction of someone's initial problems, and then what happens as the problems grow, and how it's not just to do with memory, it's lots of different things. And Tony has become quite a pioneer in doing work to help people understand dementia better through his cartoons, which is wonderful. Just using these simple cartoons, he's able to get across this message of what dementia is. And in fact, Tony, for Christmas, he's developed this calendar, so for 2021, with the Exeter Dementia Action Alliance, to create a calendar to help people understand dementia better. And in this, he's got different months have got different depictions. So in this one, for example, in February, an older person is being taken for a stroll by someone, but she doesn't know it's her daughter. And I think that must be one of the most painful times in dementia, when a parent has forgotten who their child is. And this is a part of therapy where the person is being taught about what the changing landscape of who they are is, to try to get them to understand what memory has done to them. So Tony has created this calendar to raise money for Exeter Dementia Action Alliance. And if anyone is interested in getting a calendar, they cost £7, including post and packing. So if you're interested and would like to support a dementia charity, to raise money, to do more research, and to help in the centres that they're running, then please do write to Tony at cartoons@tonyhusband.co.uk. Now, when I was talking about Still Alice, I was saying that this is something that's happening more and more. And in the UK, we've got an aging population. This is what's known as population pyramid. And what it is it's a graphical depiction of how many people we have of different ages. So along the vertical axis, which is the x-axis, you have different ages. So right at the bottom, it's people who are 0 to 1 year old, 1 to 2 years old, etc. And as we get further up, we get to older ages like 70, 80, 90, 100. And what we see is that these pyramids are narrowing. So basically, as we get to the higher ages, past 60 years old, we see fewer and fewer people in 1966 who were getting to those older ages. But what we see in 2016 is that that pyramid has changed shape. And now the middle part is getting wider, and that's the baby boomers of the 1950s who are now reaching those older ages. And what we see is that more people are getting to those older ages in the 80s and 90s, and we've got a thinning lower down. And then by 2066, the prediction is that we're going to have far more people over the age of 70 than we've ever had. So that's for the UK. Globally, this is the picture in 2015, and this is the percentage of people in different countries who are over 65. And what we see in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Southern Asia and parts of South America is that the proportion of people who get to over 65 is quite small, so under 20%. But in Northern Europe, we see many more people getting to those older ages. So that was 2015. So the hotter the color, the higher the proportion of people in that country who've got to the older ages. This is what the prediction is for 2050. So parts of sub-Saharan Africa are still not doing well, but the rest of the world is doing much better in terms of getting people to older ages, which is fantastic. So thanks to medical care, etc., people are living better and longer lives, which is great. However, Alzheimer's doesn't care about how healthy someone is physically. Alzheimer's is something, Alzheimer's and other dementias, they're neurological disorders that start affecting people as they get older. So the important point here is that someone can stay physically able and have physical activity, which is fine, but their brain can start deteriorating. So as we get these older populations, what we're going to have is a huge mushrooming in the amount of dementia that's going to be diagnosed. And because of the cost of dementia, financially, socially, and emotionally for the families, etc., this is a time bomb waiting to go off. Now, as I said with Still Alice, one of the things that was inaccurate about that film was the fact that they were able to diagnose her very quickly with just one test, and that is not the case. So the holy grail at the moment is to develop better tests of dementia so that we can detect dementia at much earlier ages. So that's what's happening. And I'm very pleased to say that there's wonderful work that's been done by this amazing person, Terry McGibbon, who is a PhD student of mine and who I jokingly and lovingly call the boss, because he's so amazing that one day when he's got his PhD, he's going to be my supervisor. Terry developed a test that we've called ValMT. And the reason that ValMT is important is that we're using it to look at how people remember things and forget them. So let's go back to Dory. Dory could remember things for about a minute and a half, but then she forgot things very quickly because she's got Alzheimer's, sorry, not Alzheimer's, she's got amnesia. Now, our older folks, we know my mother, her memory is getting worse, but she is 82 years old, so we'll give her that. What we want to do is to try to work out how people forget, how quickly they forget, and what is it that differentiates those people who forget more quickly from those who don't forget quickly. So in this task, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, we teach people information, and then we test them 5 minutes, 30 minutes, and just under an hour later. And this is how young people who are in their 20s perform. So they started very well, but even an hour later, they haven't really forgotten much. Older people in their 60s and above, we've found that there are actually two different types of older people. There are some older people who we call fast learners. They learn our task really quickly, and if they learn it very quickly, then compared to our young people, these 60-year-olds are virtually indistinguishable, so they're not showing any problems. But there are some people who learn our task more slowly, and when we track their memory 5, 30, and 55 minutes later, this is what happens with them. They show what we call catastrophic forgetting, such that after about an hour, they've forgotten a huge amount. And so the difference between the dots, the dotted line and the full red line, those people are the same age. We've got 60-year-olds who forget hardly anything after an hour, and other 60-year-olds who've forgotten a huge amount. Now, the reason that this is important is because we already know the statistics of older people who progress to start complaining of memory problems, and who, out of that, how many people then progress to a full-blown diagnosis of dementia. Now, the reason this is important is because we then asked the young people, our fast elderly and our slow elderly, about what their memory was like. So this is where we actually just asked them, do you think you tend to forget much? Our young people said not much. Our fast older people said, no, don't really forget much. Our slow elderly said that they tend to forget a lot. So what we see here is that in this task that we've developed, we're picking up a difference on our task, which mirrors the subjective report from older people. And if we know that people who complain of memory problems then progress, or a proportion of them progress to dementia, then what we think is that within our task VAL-MT, we might have found an early preclinical signature of dementia, such that we would predict that some of the people in our slow elderly group, we would predict will go on to dementia in the next few years. Now, the reason that that's important is that we can tell you that now. However, when we look on a standard test called the Bachelor logical memory scale, the details aren't important. What we see is that although they're performing, that dotted line is a bit below the full red line, statistically, there's no difference between those two groups on this test. So if a clinician, a neuropsychologist, was to see the older people, the slow older people from our study, and they tested them on the Wechsler test, they would assume that there's no problem there. So on a clinical diagnosis, those older, slower people, they would come away with effectively a clean bill of health. Whereas on our task, we would predict that in a few years' time, they're going to start showing signs of dementia. And that's really important because we might have a signature there of people who might eventually go on to develop dementia. And that is what we're working on at the moment. So to summarize, what I've tried to do in this talk is to give you a sense of why it's really important that the media portrays aspects of neurological disorders accurately. I've only concentrated on head injuries and memory in this talk, just because as I started developing the talk, I realized that there was so much here that it was better to concentrate on the details rather than escape through things quickly. So I may create another talk about things like the diving bell and the butterfly and autism and some other things. So I may do that. But looking at head injuries, we see that media portrayals of head injuries can be really inaccurate, and that in fact we know from a lot of different types of work, but particularly from films like Concussion, which are based in fact, that small head injuries add up to big problems later on in life. And in fact, my next talk will be about the impact of childhood head injuries on later behavioral and possibly criminal behavior. Then in terms of memory and amnesia, I showed you that portrayals such as 50 First Dates are just romanticized rubbish. In fact, Finding Nemo is much more accurate, and Memento is accurate as well. And how those portrayals are based on what we are understanding from patients with severe memory problems. But there is hope out there because we're able to help these patients by developing new methods of rehabilitation to help them remember to do things. And then towards the end, I talked about dementia and how there are some accurate portrayals, but some of the science in those portrayals, such as a simple test to diagnose dementia, are wrong. And I told you about some of the work that my group is doing, particularly Terry, to try to develop this test, which we hope we can give over to clinicians to help in their work. So what I want to just do is to say that if you were interested in any of our research, we do research on standard memory, also on dementia, on face recognition, some other areas, then do get in touch with us and email us to this address, which is art.gold.mind@gmail.com. And please include the following information: your age, your name, your age, your gender, and if you happen to have any neurological conditions that you would like to tell us about. Everything you tell us will be treated with complete confidence, and it's not going to be shared by anyone else. It will always be anonymized. So please don't worry if you get in touch with us. and do tell us if there's anything in particular you don't want us to share with anyone. But we certainly won't be giving your details to anyone else anyway. And if you want to find out more about my research team called ART, then please visit our website at this address. So I want to thank you for your patience. Those of you who've still here, I'm so sorry about those ridiculous problems. We didn't have that when we did it in the first lockdown. So when you tweet about me, please, I hope you can forgive me for that problem. My next talk will be next Saturday, and I'm certainly going to make sure that the technology is working. And this talk is going to be about the impact of childhood head injuries on behavioral issues, including possible criminality. I'm going to just have a 2-minute break, and then my team are harvesting questions from the Facebook chat. So do text in your questions on the Facebook chat, and in 2 minutes I'll start answering those. I'm going to leave you with this photograph of me with my beloved mother this morning for Diwali, because I dedicate all of my work to her and my father, who's looking down on us. So I'll see you in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Okay, I'm back. I've just heard that there were some problems with the sound. I'm sorry about this. There seems to be yet another little thing in the Zoom settings. I think Zoom did a big reboot over the last couple of months, and they've changed lots of settings. So we had problems with that. So I do apologize. Okay, I'm going to take the questions that have been sent in so far. So Lauren Crabtree asked, do you believe the portrayal of brain disorders in a simpler way can actually bring some benefit, potentially helping people who may not otherwise understand less afraid of such disorders? Lauren, that's a good question. I think my main thing isn't that simplification is a problem. It's accuracy that's the issue. So I don't have a problem with simplifying things It's when it's oversimplified to the point where you get an impression that is wrong. And one of the words that I was going to use, which I didn't manage to put into the talk, was cultural memes. So Richard Dawkins created this word memes, which are things that start spreading and become like a thing that starts living. And the problem when you oversimplify things is that it can create a cultural meme which becomes a fact, so that you end up with people thinking that what was portrayed is actually a fact. And the classic example is that we only use 10% of the brain. Now, somehow that started up at some point, and now it's become such a fact that people are always saying that to me. And I just think, where did you get that from? And it's got to that point where people just accept it as a fact when it's not at all. So whilst I don't have a problem with a simplification, the problem I have is the way that that can then get propagated into a fact as a cultural meme. I think if a simplification is done and then that's followed up with some sort of information that, by the way, this is a simplification, that in itself is okay. But it's when that qualification isn't made that the meme can start up, if you see what I mean. So it's more about misrepresentation, such as the 51st dates. I know that that wasn't a science lecture, but nonetheless, it's misrepresentation or completely being wrong, or when a cultural meme starts up and people believe something just because they saw it. So that's my problem. Okay, question from Barbara Jogelis, I think it is. Barbara's asked, has your team looked into differences between slow learners and fast learners, which would indicate any potential risk factors? That's a great question, Barbara, and that's actually what we're doing right now. We're doing a number of different studies at the moment, and that's why we are looking for lots of participants, because with anything like this, we have to keep replicating to make sure that our findings are not just flukes, that there is a basis to them. So we've been replicating that one finding for 5 years now to make sure that we get the same findings over and over again. And each year we're adding more to our level of analysis. And where the question you're asking is exactly that thing that we want to look at eventually. Once we've got a good way of identifying these fast learners and slow learners, then it's what is it about them that is doing the fast or slow learning? And that is going to take some time. We're looking at sleep because there's a whole new literature, actually it's not that new, but relatively recent, about how sleep is so central for cognitive functions. And we know that sleep at some levels is related to memory abilities, but we don't know what is the chicken and the egg. So yes, we're looking, and that's why we need people to participate, volunteer and participate in our work. Okay, the next question was, I'm treating myself to a small glass of red. I hope that's okay. Nice question from Jane Antoinette Croucher, which is that, why do I occasionally have short memory loss? For example, walking into a room and forgetting why I wasn't there, and why is it worse when I'm tired? It's a brilliant question there, Jane. Basically, memory it's a skill. If you're a runner, there are days when you're faster than other days. If you're ill, if you've been lethargic, you're going to be slower on those days. And that's for a physical ability. But in the same way, memory is a skill and it requires mental agility. If you're physically tired, that's going to affect you. If you're stressed, it's going to affect you. There are things to do with hormones. Hormones play a huge part in how well memory works. And so this is why people who are going through hormonal changes have memory issues. So when you have those momentary forgettingnesses, that's not an amnesia. That's just you being an other. You're normal, and that happens to all of us. It happens to me, and I've got an elephantine memory, but sometimes I just won't be able to remember something, maybe because I'm feeling tired or I'm stressed, or I just haven't been thinking about that stuff for a while, so there are too many cobwebs. And then there's that thing called the tip of the tongue, where you just almost got the answer, but you can't remember it. And again, that's because of sluggishness of the cognitive system. So don't worry, you're not on your own. You're actually completely normal for having those momentary lapses. That just happens. Let's see. Jonathan Gossage from Canada, I think, has asked, is there any evidence to support the possibility that long-term memory problems are associated with retrieval problems rather than with memory loss, i.e. the memory is actually in long-term memory but cannot be retrieved? That's an interesting question, Jonathan. So what Jonathan is asking is that the reason that someone might not be able to remember something is not that the information has got destroyed and isn't available, it's just that they can't get to it. And this is about the fact that memory involves a number of different stages. It involves taking information in, so the stuff that you're seeing, you're hearing, you're feeling, etc., and then creating your own experience of it. And that experience of it is then stored. So you make a little record in your hard drive up here. So you've got the bringing it in, which is called encoding. You've got the laying it down somewhere, which is called storage. And then you've got retrieval, which is finding that information. So a big question in the field of memory research and forgetting and amnesia has been, is it that people aren't just able to bring it in? Or is it to do with the fact that they haven't been able to store it properly? Or is it the fact that they can't retrieve it? It's an extremely difficult field. The research suggests that it's more of a retrieval problem. So, for example, there are ways of demonstrating that some amnesics have got the information somewhere. It's just that they're not consciously able to find it, because there are ways that sometimes you can find that information using what are called implicit tasks, but it's a very complicated field. But with some people, it is a storage issue. It's because the areas that create those codes or create those experiences have been destroyed. So it's impossible to actually write down something into the hard drive there. And so this is where researchers will compare patients with a particular problem with patients with another type of problems to demonstrate that some of them have got an inability to even store that information just because of the type of damage they've got. And other researchers will do work to show that even once you've taken the information in and stored it, if you can't find it, you can still have a memory problem. So this is where we start showing that within a pool of people who can't remember something, some of them, their problem is that they were never able to actually create something to store, and others, the problem is that they can't find it. So it is a bit of both, but it's because of the variety of different memory problems we can get. The next question is from Joanne Golden, who I think is sister of someone I sing with. Joanne has asked, in reference to what you were saying about memory being a skill, do you think that due to mobile phones and the notes function, people writing everything down on their phone leads to poorer memory function in a new generation? That's a lovely question, Joanne. Thank you very much for that. Short answer is yes. Even when I was doing my PhD, and my PhD was actually on how older people tend to remember more things from the younger part of their life, one of the big issues then was known as use it or lose it. So the idea was that if you keep practicing something, using it, then you don't use that skill. You don't lose that skill, rather. So if you just keep at something, then you might get a bit slower, etc., but you're not going to lose that skill. But when you stop using it, that's when you go rusty and then you lose it. Now, unfortunately, we're beginning to see aspects of that, and my answer involves taxi drivers. And what I mean by that is that there's a wonderful study done at University College London by Eleanor Maguire and her team, who saw something rather odd when they were doing a study that was on amnesia. So they were looking at some people who had damage in the parts of the brain over here that are our memory centers. And they were comparing them to the people with amnesia with people who didn't have amnesia, what we call healthy controls. And what they found is that there's an area called the hippocampus, which is a seahorse-shaped structure, which is about an inch in from your temples, which is extremely important in memory. And that was the area that they were looking at. And what they found is that the patients had damage in that area, which is what caused their amnesia. The healthy controls had an okay hippocampus, but there's one person, I think, or a couple of people who had huge hippocampi, like virtually on steroids. And I was thinking, what's happening here? And they found out that at least one of these people was a taxi driver. Now, in other work, some other people had been saying, you know that thing called the hippocampus, we think it's really important for our spatial navigation. So whilst the memory people were looking at it from a memory perspective, some other people were saying, it's for helping us find our way around, which when we were hunter-gatherers was extremely important. Knowing which bushes to go behind to find the food, or which ravine to go towards, which way the river's going to go, etc. Those spatial orientations were extremely important for helping us survive. And so where we were and our orientation in the world became a survival issue. And what they decided to do was to look at other taxi drivers, because taxi drivers are constantly having to find new routes, learn new routes, etc. And they did a study with London black cab drivers who were learning the knowledge, which you may or may not know is the test that taxi drivers have to do to learn lots of routes around central London, around London. And what they found is that when they compared taxi drivers who'd done the knowledge, so it's this 2-year course, compared to people who were the same age as them, same demographics, etc., but weren't taxi drivers, this hippocampus thing was huge. And what that suggests, and then they looked at some people who were learning it and they tracked them what's called longitudinally. So when they started 6 months later, a year later, a year and a half later, etc. And what they saw was that this area, the hippocampus, was growing in these people. So what we have here is an example of what's called neuroplasticity, which is that if you use something, that skill and that part of the brain gets active, and that it can grow. And so that neuroplasticity was demonstrating to us that the hippocampus was actually increasing in size in people who were doing the knowledge. Interestingly, just a year or 2 years ago, that same group, Eleanor Maguire's group, they started publishing papers that demonstrated that the same area in the hippocampus is beginning to switch off because of people using sat-navs. So exactly as you said in your question, what's happening is that if people aren't using this particular ability, taking notes, et cetera, or listening actively just because they'll be able to write something down, or they've got a handout from their university classes, etc. If people don't use it, then what will happen is that they will lose it. So yes, I would say that these things, mobile phones, etc., we start externalizing our skills. Just as I was saying with the Guy Pearce character in Memento, externalizing the skills, it gets to the point where no one remembers a phone number. People don't remember other people's birth dates because it's all in this thing. So why do you need to? Which is kind of okay if you're going to use your extra space for something else. But it seems that we're just externalizing to these guys too much, and that is potentially problematic. And of course, this will take a few years to work out because maybe we're developing some amazing skills instead now that we're externalizing things to these phones. So thank you for your question. Okay, I'm going to ask whether there are any more questions coming in. I haven't seen any yet, but let's see. I think there's another one. No more questions. So I'm gonna sit here and wait to see if any more questions come in. I'll drink my wine. And for those of you who don't know, the Diwali Festival of Lights, I'll just give you a cultural education as well. The Diwali Festival of Lights is to do with the Hindu Vedic epic, the Ramayana, in which there's a big holy battle, and Lord Rama, who's an important mythological character, wins this battle, and after winning the battle, he's led back to the holy city of Ayodhya in northern India by the people in the forest, lighting his way back to the holy city with little tea lamps called divas, and those little tea lamps were guiding his way to the holy city, and that's why Diwali is called the Festival of Lights. And after that, they got to the holy city, and the following day there was lots of celebration with fireworks, etc. And so tomorrow, for Hindus around the world, it is New Year's Day, because having vanquished evil today with the victory of good over evil, tomorrow is our Hindu New Year. So Sal Mubarak, which is the way we say Happy New Year, to my Hindu friends around the world. Let's see. A question has come in. So Suzanne has asked, how do we future-proof against dementia? I have quite a stressful, unfulfilling job. Is that bad for me? That's an interesting question. Suzanne, how do we foolproof? And unfortunately, this is a chicken and egg question. It kind of relates to Barbara's question, in fact. So if you and Barbara could get together and find me lots and lots of people who are in their 60s to do my study, then I'll be able to answer both of you. Because until we know what the problem is with dementia, we don't know how to foolproof against it. But I'm now going to bring in Joanne, who asked the question about use it or lose it. That basically, we don't know whether these are biological processes that we have no say over. If you've got the gene, you've got the gene. But in the absence of knowing that, we know that if you practice something or if you keep a skill up, then you're more likely to keep that. So I think part of this is maintaining mental activity, and that's where the use of devices that externalize too much, I think that can be problematic unless, of course, you're using that time profitably. There are other things as well. We know that there are lifestyle issues. So diet can have an impact. We know that there are certain oily fishes, for example, that have a certain omega complex are particularly good for memory formation and memory stability. So I think diet can be helpful. We know, that, as I was saying to, I think, who asked the question to do with, Jane. So I'm bringing everyone together. So I'm bringing you all into one answer with Jane's question about forgetting something, if she's tired, etc. We know that stress can have an impact on memory and things like that. So it's been shown that people who engage in mindfulness meditation, there are parts of their brain that are usually getting thinner as a result of getting older, just part of natural aging, that those people who continue meditate and keep meditating, they are protecting themselves against that natural thinning that's happening in the brain. That's happening to everyone because it's part of biology. But we can protect against that to some level, not completely, but to some level, by things like mindfulness meditation. So I think that if there's a biological genetic thing, you can't escape that. That's there, unfortunately. But if it's not biological and we think it's stress and things like that, then lifestyle issues such as diet and better diet can be useful. And we know that engaging in practices such as mindfulness meditation can help parts of the brain in terms of clarity and the stressful impact on the brain. Because we know that the brain is affected by its environment. And this is to do with how our biology can be affected by our environment. So if you have a lot of stress, then that is going to impact your brain eventually. So removing that stress or reducing that stress through practices such as mindfulness meditation can be beneficial. I hope that helps. And I hope that your job becomes less stressful or more fulfilling. Lofty has asked, so dogs get memory issues, and do they remember people by their smell? Well, yes, I think that happens with dogs. And I know my darling friend Jilly, who might be listening, her beloved Suki, who passed away a couple of months ago, who I knew well for a decade or so. Towards the end of Suki's life, she was showing the signs of dementia and being forgetful and etc. So these same processes that allow us to remember, because remember, memory isn't a human ability. Memory is something that all animals need to be able to survive. And so I think dogs, any animals can get dementia as Suki did. So I think that dogs can have memory issues, and whether they remember people by their smell, probably. But probably other things as well. I think that well, for example, Suki, I know was highly traumatized from her previous life. She was a rescue dog, and she had a certain fear of certain types of people, and that wasn't about their smell, because these were new people. There were certain types of people that she had difficulties with. So whilst a dog might be very reliant or have this incredible sense of smell, which is something like 1,000 times better than ours, they are also using other abilities. So they'll use smell to remember people, but I think they'll use other abilities as well. Okay. Jonathan Gossage again from Canada has asked, is there any work on mindfulness techniques that are not visually based? There are lots of techniques that aren't visually based. I've done mindfulness meditation a number of times, and most of them didn't involve visual imagery. Breathing meditations, etc., are not visually based, so only some of them have got a visual component. So yes, I'm sure there are many that are like that. Okay. Any more questions? I don't know if I've got any more questions, and I think I've given you a cultural education about Diwali. So let's see if there's any questions on my personal Facebook page. Let's see. So Rebecca McKay has asked, I think, how does the method of loci work on our memory? Does this work with amnesia? The method of loci is a technique that was developed by the Greek orators thousands of years ago to try to remember their big speeches, and it was a way where they imagined a place that they knew and a route that they would walk down a lot, so they knew that this temple was on the left-hand side, and I don't know what was in ancient Greece, and that shop selling ancient Greek things, which were currently Greek things, was on the right-hand side, and that other shop was over there, etc. And they'd walk through this route, and they would place items in each of these areas, and they'd create mental images which were interactive. So the method of loci was remembering a very well-known route visually, and leaving things behind in each of those areas and creating images with those areas. So if the first thing you wanted to remember was an elephant, you think about the elephant walking around the temple. And if the second thing was a bottle of wine, then you'd imagine your shop of Greek objects being of Greek red wine. And if the third thing was something to do with cats, then you'd imagine cats running all over this place, etc. And so the idea is that you'd create these visual images and leave them in this familiar route, so that later on, when you're trying to remember them, as you walk through that area and you think, okay, where do I usually go to first? It's usually the temple that's on my left-hand side. And you look at the temple and there's this lovely big elephants walking around it. And you think, oh, yes, elephants. And then as you're walking down, you see that shop that you know, and you see all these lovely bottles of red wine, and you think, oh, I think bottles of red wine is the next thing. And then the third thing at the next shop was these cats doing crazy things, which is what cats do. And so you think, oh, third thing was cat. So that's how the method of loci works. And interestingly, it's related to that hippocampus stuff that I was saying earlier, that our spatial navigation is really important for our memory. In terms of whether it works with amnesia, I don't know if any work that has tried to do that, but I think the problem with that is that teaching an amnesic to use that skill is very difficult. So like I said with Nicola, my patient, teaching her how to use that palm top, my mum has only just started using a smartphone, and she's 82 now, and so bless her, it takes her a bit of getting used to, but she's managed to do it, and it took her a few goes. So it takes a bit of time. With Nicola, it took us about 4 weeks to teach her how to use a relatively straightforward device, and that's because we can't rely on them to remember. with my mum, at least I can say, come on, don't you remember I told you that thing before? And she's like, oh, yes, of course. So I can rely on saying to my mother, don't you remember that thing? But by definition, you can't rely on that with an amnesic. So you have to use other techniques. So as far as I know, it doesn't really work with people with amnesia. Okay, I think that we're almost done. I'm just going to ask my team of helpers whether there is anything else that they think is going to come in. Otherwise, what I want to do first of all is thank you all. I don't know how many of you are still there, but I would thank you all for your patience. I'm so sorry about this. I did have a dry run with Loci earlier, and it seemed to be going okay, and then suddenly it all went pear-shaped, and that's probably because of the reconfiguring that's happened both on Zoom and Facebook since the last time we did these talks, which was in June. So for those of you who stuck with me, I'm thanking you for your loyalty and your perseverance. I hope I didn't mess up your evening too much. I hope that me taking you to the movies was enjoyable. And I hope that you will forgive me by coming to the next talk, which will be on hopefully a fascinating issue, which is that we've started to understand that there's a big link between head injuries and criminal behavior. And unfortunately, a lot of these head injuries happen during childhood. And so my next talk is going to be to try to look at this complex and worrying issue, which is about childhood head injuries and the consequences of childhood head injuries. Because anyone who has children knows that it's a very complex point in life for all sorts of reasons, social, emotional, etc. And there are a lot of emotional changes happening, but a lot of all those emotional changes that are happening are actually because of what's happening within the brain. And unfortunately, we know that any kind of small areas of damage or even dysfunction in terms of deprivation, lack of emotional input, etc., can have real negative consequences later on. And so I'm going to try to explore some of that next time and see what it is that we can try to learn from some of this and what we need to be careful about. Okay, I'm going to do one last check, and then if there isn't anything else, I will sign off. Yes, no more questions. So I think I'm going to call it today. Thank you very much, people. I hope it was worth it, and I look forward to the next talk. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.